I'm very excited to be speaking with Steven Goldberg, who is the author of Why Men Rule, which is an updated version of The Inevitability of Patriarchy. Both excellent books. Steven, perhaps you could just speak a little bit about what those books are all about, what your theory is, and how you came to study those ideas and to express them.
My pleasure. Many years ago, when I was a young assistant professor, I wrote an essay having nothing to do with men and women, but in it I had a footnote. And in the footnote, I basically said what is today pretty much the accepted view of sociology, which is that aside from the obvious differences between men and women, like women give birth, most of the aspects of female cognition and behavior are a function of socialization, of social values, that biology has very little to do with it. And I said this in the footnote, and fortunately, before we went to publication, I said, maybe I should find out if I know what the hell I'm talking about. So I looked up 3 anthropologists from the anthropology department, and all 3 kind of hemmed and hawed. They really, I said, it doesn't even have to be a matriarchy, even an equiarchy, one where neither males nor males. And they said, well, we really, off the top of our heads, we can't think of one. So I then looked into it much more, and I found over a couple of years about 50 claims of societies that weren't patriarchies, which I'll explain in a minute. I looked at the original works, the original ethnographies, which it was quite clear the person who wrote the sociology book or the popular book never had. I mean, in some cases, they had quoted a book from the Finnish Archaeological Association readings of 1741. I actually went and saw them, and they had enough dust on them. It was clear they had not been touched before the author of the book that quoted, or not quoted them, but claimed them, had been bought. None of these exceptions began to be exceptions. It wasn't like, well, it was ambiguous, maybe. It was never. And I quoted from every one in an appendix. I quoted from each one of those, and it was just ludicrous to have claimed that these lacked one of 3 institutions. The first institution, we're talking, by the way, about between 2,000 and 3,000 and 5,000, 2,000 and 5,000 societies on which we have evidence. Now, that range is not so big because there are like 3,000 societies that some people say were there and some say no. It's a question of how rigorous your definition of society. One group would say, well, these 2 are too close to be separate societies. Another would say they're no separate. So if you're more liberal about it, you'll have 5,000, at very least 2,000. And what you find is that every one of these, let's even call them 2,000 societies, has particular institutions. One is patriarchy. Patriarchy means that the hierarchies are dominated by men. Now, of course, occasionally there's a Golda Meir. Maybe there'll be a Hillary Clinton. But they are always exceptions. The queen is a queen only when there was no king available. And they are always surrounded by men. If Hillary Clinton is president, she's going to be surrounded by a Congress that's 80 or 85% male. So that's one. That's that's patriarchy, which is the hierarchies. The second is that whatever the non-maternal role that is given highest status tends to be male. Now, it may be, and I didn't study this, it conceivably is that in some societies, the maternal role has the highest status. I can't say that that's the case, I just don't know. But I'm not denying that, I just don't know. But of the non-maternal roles, the ones given highest status are male. Now, I mean, Margaret Mead said when she reviewed my book, and she agreed with all the empirical evidence that I gave, and she said, you know, men may sit around talking about hummingbirds, while women are out doing the economic work in the field. So sort of objectively, it's not that the men do the more important work, but in terms of what the society considers more important, the males do it. Now, usually, to the extent that once I mentioned this, people would explain to me, say, well, that's because the males do it, that gets the higher status. I think it's the other way around. It's because it has higher status, males are more strongly motivated to do it, and so that they tend to get it. Now, always, when you're talking about males and females, you're talking in statistical terms. And the thing to keep in mind, and half of the ridiculous arguments that you get from environmentalists is if they only thought, when they're making an argument, to say to themselves, does this apply to height? Because if it applies to height, then obviously it's not a refutation of the importance of physiology. So, for example, an argument I've often heard is, well, the difference between the shortest woman and the taller, they use it with aggression or whatever, but let's say the shortest woman and the tallest woman, that's great, or the shortest man and the tallest man, in each case 3 or 4 feet, that is greater than the difference in average between men and women. Well, that's true, but obviously that doesn't refute physiology as a cause, because unless somebody's going to argue that men are taller for environmental reasons, they're told to be, obviously it's not purely environmental. So many of the environmentalist arguments basically are arguments that would reduce to the height argument. In any case, so that's, there's patriarchy, there's male attainment, I call it. That's the attainment of those status roles. One that's a little subtler, but clearly is there, is male dominance. That is in male-female relationships. Now, if you watch movies from 30 years ago, it's very clear. There was the idea that the male took the lead. Women liked this as much as men did. It's one of the aspects that when people have an ideology, they tend to think that everybody who lived in with a different ideology, a different value system, they were miserable. So they will talk about women in the 50s were horribly unhappy. No, they weren't. Things changed. Today's women might be terribly unhappy living like the 50s, but women in the 50s, unless a woman had to work, they kind of looked down on women. It wasn't feminine or just whatever. It wasn't quite right. Now that has changed. The attitudes and values have changed. But one essential idea of mine is that attitudes and values are not the crucial causal elements that make these distinctions I'm talking about. They tend to conform to them. Less today than 50 years ago, but the attitudes aren't the crucial thing. Men and women are still like men and women, and the attitudes will be ratify them a lot or be a little more ambiguous, but it's not that's crucial. And anyway, male dominance, if you see these movies of 30 years ago, you see it very clearly. Now it tends to be denied. Oh, the woman is the equal and always right. But the fact that they're always complaining that men don't treat them as the equal indicates that if you want to say what are the least patriarchal societies, and there's no such thing as one that's not patriarchal, but maybe the Scandinavian countries. They're a little more than the United States, but they have department ministries against discrimination against women. Well, I think it's fair enough to say as long as there's a department ministry against discrimination against women, it's hard to argue that's not a patriarchy. So in any case, I don't want to beat this to death, but those 3 elements are universal. At one time, while people hadn't really studied it, it was just accepted. If you look at an anthropology book from the 40s, it will say in societies, men is the head of the family, women is if not the head at the home, because that's not the case, but they are it's sort of like the Jewish, the caretaker of the home. That now that's tend to look down upon, but it tends to be true to a great extent in any case. One of the complaints that sometimes made about mine is they say, Goldberg says that because these institutions are universal, therefore they are inevitable. No, I don't say because they are universal. It was universal 200 years ago. No society had a car. Now they all have cars. So obviously the fact that something's universal doesn't prove it's inevitable. But if it's not something clearly technological, if it's universal, you have to ask why do the Americans, the Japanese, the British, the Mondugamore, the Mbudi, every society from the most primitive to the most modern, why do they always work the same way? And you wouldn't say that patriarchy is inevitable because it's been universal, but you might say whatever made it universal might make it inevitable. I would argue that it does. So far, I've been right. You can prove me. The original title of my book, which I preferred, was The Inevitability of Patriarchy. And the reason I preferred that title is it does what a scientific theory or hypothesis is supposed to do. It specified directly what it is that would refute the theory. if one society turned up, or if somebody discovered some ancient society that wasn't patriarchal, my theory is dead. But so far, that hasn't happened. Now, what does this have to do with behavior? Basically, without getting into the biology, which I do in the book, but I won't get into here. Basically, male and female biology is different. For obvious reasons, female biology had to develop in accord with giving birth. Male biology, basically for aggression. And this has made the aggression not only in the going to war sense, though that's a part of it, but also in the sense of you say he's an aggressive businessman. That's more built into men. Sure, there are plenty of women who are more aggressive than plenty of men. There are plenty of women who are taller than many men. But basically, statistically, there's a kind of sociological law of large averages. When you're talking about lots of people, the basic differences manifest themselves. I don't know whether you had mentioned, and what about socialization? Socialization is not an independent variable. So that people who say, well, the socialization can change the biological differences, the physiological differences, socialization conforms. There's a range. So you can be either like the Arabs, or you can be like the certain African societies, and extreme differences between men and women, or you can be like the United States or England or Scandinavian societies, where the differences are much less. They still have patriarchy, they still have male dominance, still have male attainment.
Sure.
And that's the point. Government, some people talk about government imposing these things. The question is, how come every kind of government, whenever anybody denies the physiological difference as a crucial causal element, you have to ask, how come every one of the ones they're talking about, economic difference, political difference, cultural difference, how come they all work the same way? And then obviously, Occam's razor, you go for the simplest correct answer. And the simplest answer is the physiological difference sets limits. You can have a wide range in economic systems, a wide range in governmental systems, but the range is limited by imposition of biology.
That's an excellent argument, but I mean, it's very popular today, particularly among the left, though I would argue not exclusively so, to say that everything is a social construct. Except of course for homosexuality.
Yes.
Then they
exactly.
Say,
It shows the degree to which these ideologies and the political correctness take over. That it's not just the left; it's more the left. But even the conservative, John Derbyshire, a conservative writer, a very good conservative writer, was banned from the National Review, William Buckley's magazine, because he said basically the kind of thing that I'm saying. That and forget it if you say about race, then you're dead. But even talking about sexual differences, even the conservatives tend to be afraid to say it. And it's just that at colleges, there's a lot of complaint right now. At Williams College, Derbyshire was supposed to speak recently, and the president of the college, not some left-wing group, the president of the college banned him. Because said, well, it's not stuff that our students should hear. I mean, like a college, that's what you're supposed to have in a college. People hear things they're not supposed to hear. I spoke at a very good small college a number of years ago. Every year they had a lecture by someone who was chosen because he is saying something that the students would not want to hear. That's practically gone now, and it's frightening. It's really frightening.
Yes. When I try to speak with people, I mean, like you say, forget about racial realism, but when I try to even speak about gender realism with people, they're insistent that there isn't a definite distinction between the sexes. Or the genders, they would say. So there's gender fluidity. The perfect example for their argument, hermaphrodites, for instance, and other things like that. You go into that a little bit in your book. Perhaps you could explain your thoughts on that matter.
Well, I go into that only in that hermaphrodites And in this sense, that was sort of unpopular at the time too. They throw a light on the role of biology. There was some who would say, well, hermaphrodites are simply a function of raising, Freudian kinds of explanation. It was clear that there was a physiological. Now it's widely accepted. There's a strong physiological idea. It's interesting. You use the word gender. Gender. It's not a word that used to be used much. He called it sex, but gender has an environmental element. Sex sounds more biological, so they will all use the word gender, even if they're talking about purely biological things.
Right.
It's very strange, and it really. I mean, you can only hope. I have an ultimate belief that truth in the long run wins, and if that's the case, then sooner or later people will come along. But it's taken a long time. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, I believe you're right, and obviously I hope you're right on that as well. Another question I wanted to ask you, you've mentioned, you've just touched upon it slightly there. Feminists, on the one hand, would like to have the state intervene in order to suppress the oppression from men.
In Western cities, they certainly don't in Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
Oh, of course, yes, yeah. Speaking more of the West. Thank you. No, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, you're quite right. In the West, particularly, and then I think as a reaction to that increasingly strong movement, even to the extent that it's going into PC territory as well, there are groups splitting off from the men's rights activist movement. So on the internet, for instance, there's the MGTOW community, which is men going their own way. And there are some extreme people within that even who think that a legitimate role of government would be to suppress women and to enforce male rights, particularly within a marriage. So to try and artificially create a patriarchy. So it's just going haywire now.
From my point of view, I'm a strong believer in that. Obviously, as a person, I have certain political ideas and all. Basically, I believe that someone who's interested in studying empirical things should basically stay away from political ideologies, because what you want to do is find out what is the case. Now, if what you just described actually became the case, then that would be something to study. But it wouldn't be, in any case, I wouldn't particularly want that, but I wouldn't be pushing for that, even whether I wanted it or not. That's pushing for a political thing, whereas what I want to do is study what happens. What's interesting now is reporters, or the pundits as they call them, are astonished that in this, at least in terms of the Republican primaries with Trump and all that now, it seems both for the Democrats, particularly for the Democrats, young women are not particularly for Hillary Clinton. Now, I mean, you would be astonished. But of course, young women haven't, in my generation, the women understandably, there were things that they had to complain about. The women weren't paid. Women nowadays, sure, there's still some difference, but by and large, it doesn't affect most women. They have a life that's much closer to men's, unless they're going to get very angry about men or most of the people in the hierarchies. But they don't. Now they're living more or less normal lives, and so they don't automatically go for Hillary Clinton. So in that sense, it's going the opposite way, or the way in which the men that you were talking about, taking it back, or whatever that phrase was. But still, by and large, the ideology is overwhelming, and you can just hope that people start. I mean, look, the blunt truth is that 90% of the population believes what they want to believe. And it's very hard to get them to believe that which all the evidence indicates isn't the case if they don't want it to be the case.
Yes. Just reminded me, actually, I'll have to link in the description box. There was a study I saw recently in the US and the UK which said that it's actually only a minority of women who would describe themselves as a feminist.
Now, this was about 15 years ago, but my nephew and my niece, who both went to Harvard, and they both say that the majority of women, if you call them a feminist, they would say, no, I'm not a feminist. They basically agree. Who doesn't agree with, women should get equal pay for equal work, or that kind of thing? Nobody argues, no, women should get less for doing the same work. But to be a stronger feminist than that, even 15 years ago, most women weren't like it, but they don't talk about it that much. It's the feminists who do. It's like political types in general will do most of the talking.
Yes. You said that we don't socialize the gender into our children. I have a number of friends who think that my daughter's going to end up being very feminine simply because we dressed her in pink when she was a baby.
Right.
And my boy is going to end up extremely butch because we dressed him in blue when he was a baby.
Most parents will tend to do what you are doing. Now, you may have done it somewhat more. Most are not necessarily going to think of dressing them in pink. They're going to give the little girls dolls. They're not going to give them machine guns. Now, it's true there's a lot of anti-gun sentiment, so they'll give boys trucks rather than guns, but they're still going to give the little boys. It's a minority of parents who really socialize the two children the same. Even the ones who believe that they should, they don't do it. They know the little boys are different from little girls, and they don't want to treat the little girl like she's a little boy, the little boy like she's a little girl. So as a result, they treat them like boys and girls like girls. And then it shouldn't be surprising that basically, where this is coming out now, and it's one of the few political things I do feel strongly about, women in combat. There is no question that since there's a 7-foot-tall woman in China, I have to say, there was, I'm not sure if she's still alive, this was 25 years ago, but there was a 7-foot-tall woman in China. Doesn't mean that women are as tall as men. There may be a few outliers, a couple of women who could be good in combat. To me, it seems crazy. It's true. It's discrimination against them to not let women in combat. But you're talking about defending the country. You got to give, yes, there'll be a little bit of discrimination there, but that's too bad. If it's a question of the army and it's a very small number of women that you're discriminating against, think of the discrimination where we have the Title IX with girls' teams getting equal support. The whole thing with the feminists was equal performance gets equal reward. Sounds very fair. You have wrestling teams in college which disappear because they have to support a women's soccer team. Well, the men are much better at sports. This is clear discrimination. It may be justified. As I'm saying, it's justified to discriminate against a small number of women who'd be good in combat for other reasons. Maybe they're right. I don't take argument in this one way or the other. Maybe they're right to say the value of sports for girls in schools or whatever justifies discriminating against a huge number of boys, say in college, who aren't quite good enough to make the male team, but are better than anybody in the female team. You're taking their chance away so that girls can have teams. That is discriminating for what you see as a better cause. That's what I'd say. It's a much clearer case with combat and discriminating against a few women who would be good in combat.
Speaking about that movement now to try and get women even to be conscripted for war, I just think it's become so crazy that we're so for quality. It seems to be that when we have these words that sound virtuous, we turn off the rationality.
Yeah, if they wanted to say, look, for defensive purposes, that there are a lot of positions in the army that aren't combat or fighting positions that women can serve. It makes sense in the sense you're getting a bunch of people who would be qualified for that. But then that they can't stop with. It's got to be, they're going to have every role in the army, including the combat roles. That's just crazy.
Yeah. The gist I got from the book was that rather than we make boys into girls, boys into boys, and girls into girls,
right,
we play to their talents effectively. So if we had a child that showed some musical ability, for instance, well, we send them to singing lessons, dance lessons, piano lessons, whatever.
Right.
So because there's an advantage to women behaving in a more feminine way, they're going to be able to get their way more, they're going to be able to do more, have a social advantage behaving that way. And
it's related to maternal behavior.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it would be crazy for a society to not take advantage of the natural talents of their people. A society should be free enough so the exceptions have the opportunity to express themselves. So a male who is more feminine, a female who is more masculine, they should have the opportunity to express them, but they're going to be a minority. You can't have the whole society being based on that.
Right. Yeah, I think that ties in a little bit with what we were speaking about before, the sport, maybe the military activity, because if you just say, in the movies, for instance, you have these very, very thin ladies and they are just taking down several guys, you know,
Right.
3 times their size.
Right.
And on the other hand, when you have women who want to join the Marines or something like that, they have to give them a different standard with which to then
Right.
enter the Marines. It's not
Yeah.
quite the same. We do actually, deep down, we understand this. We understand that if we are to say, right, let's have a women's American football, rugby, whatever team versus a male rugby team,
Right.
it's more likely that the men are going to win. So if we just pit the women on an equal plane against men in terms of these physical activities, or indeed any activity where there's going to be competition,
Right.
it's going to be likely that we are disadvantaging those women, indeed our daughters, and so we're
Well,
more likely then to
and what
give them a
this
different advantage.
what this leads to is a misrepresentation. There were just recently 2 women who qualified for the Rangers, which is a tough army group. Now, one thing they never mentioned was there were different levels of Rangers. They qualified for the first level.
Right.
It may be they made it perfectly reasonably, but what everybody tends to think, or to wonder, I shouldn't say think, but to wonder is, was there any chance that none of the women would have made it? There was no chance. There is so much a bias in the army from the bottom to the top, whether rightly or wrongly, from the buck private to the general. They hate the idea of women in combat. You won't hear a single one of them say it because they'll never get promoted. Well, the same thing applies here. These 2 women, out of I don't know how many, a good number, but these 2 women became Rangers. Maybe perfectly validly, I wouldn't say not, but you can't wonder. You know there was no way they weren't going to have a couple of women make it. So you just don't know.
I want to make sure that I've actually understood what the thrust of your book is. Now, if I were to describe it in a few words to someone, if I were to recommend your book, and I do, if I were to summarize it, I would say men have testosterone. And when we're teenagers, we get a lot of it. And then something called sexual dimorphism occurs. That means that we irrevocably become men. And the effect of testosterone is that we become more aggressive.
Right.
And because of that aggression, where there is competition, say, for instance, for the positions, hierarchical positions that are more valued in a society, they're more likely to get that. And it's that factor, it's testosterone, which makes the patriarchy inevitable.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Now, I would say also on another level that these differences between men and women manifest themselves in the social institutions. And so the social institutions are not sort of random. Certain ones tend to make use of those male abilities you just talked about, certain ones about the female ability, and that's why every single society has the same institutions. Very different in their particular nature, but always in the same direction. No society associates warfare with women or childcare with men.
As a libertarian, I'm very interested in what's the natural order or the spontaneous order that's formed in human societies. And the fact that patriarchy then becomes inevitable makes me think that when I see these, fairly extreme men's rights activist groups saying we need to enforce some sort of patriarchy, we need a system to enforce it, or on the other hand, I see the feminists saying, well, we need to struggle against it as much as possible. I tend to think, well, there's no need. A patriarchy will come about. But I think the important thing is what people need to know is that doesn't necessarily mean oppression. That doesn't mean people have to have their private property rights or whatever violated.
Right. All you have to do to show that something isn't inevitable is to show that there's one society where it's not the case. So if there's one society where people's property rights are not violated, that shows that there may be patriarchy may be inevitable, but that is not an inevitable aspect of patriarchy.
Yes. If you could show one instance where there was a proper matriarchy demolish your argument in a sense, or at least it would be a step towards demolishing it. And there hasn't been one. I loved in your book, and you repeat it on your website as well, where you say that some people actually point to the Amazons, the Greek myth of the Amazons, as being an example of a proper matriarchy in history, and the lengths that they go to try and assert that this is true. It becomes ridiculous because, as you point out, that the centaurs didn't really exist.
The Cyclops didn't really exist.
Yes, and it really, if they're to look at the Greek mythology and say, oh well, this group existed, to be consistent, they'd have to say things like that. I mean, do you find all of the arguments brought against your theory to be as ridiculous as that, or what would you say are the best arguments you've come across, and how would you respond?
Look, I don't think there's any very good argument, because they're arguing for something that plainly isn't true. The better argument is one where they don't deny that patriarchy is inevitable, but then they try to explain differences, and there are certainly differences. So if you want to create the difference between the United States and Saudi Arabia, fine, as long as you don't argue that one of them's really not patriarchal. There are certainly perfectly good arguments. I don't address them because they're not arguing against what I say. If they're trying to argue, really nobody does it anymore, to be perfectly honest. When I wrote my book, well, I can tell you, in sociology textbooks, this was a long time ago, but I went, probably 30 years ago, I went to Barnes & Noble bookstore, and I looked through all of their introductory sociology textbooks. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 30 of 33 quoted Margaret Mead about the Chambuli, a particular New Guinea group, that saying that this was a society that was not patriarchal. Margaret Mead denied it at the time she wrote the book. People criticized when she wrote her original book. She made a speech. She denied it. When she reviewed my book many years later, she said that everything empirical I say in my book was true. Yet, even it was just 20 years ago, I bet you there's still at least half that number, that 30 of 33 or whatever number of books said about Margaret Mead showed with the Chambuli, they're an exception, therefore societies don't have to be patriarchal. I may not quite put it like that, but there doesn't have to be that kind of gender bias. That's what happens in sociology textbooks, the introductory textbooks. Sometimes it's because they outright know it's not true. Many times these introductory textbooks tend to steal from each other, so they don't even know it's not true. They just read it in another textbook. They say, "Ooh, that makes sense." It didn't make any sense. Margaret Mead never said that it made any sense. But there's plenty of ridiculous stuff. As I say, as you get more into the area where they're not denying patriarchy, but they're trying to talk about the differences, that's perfectly legitimate. That's a difference. It doesn't interest me very much, but it's perfectly legitimate.
And of course, you can't even begin to mention IQ differences between men and women either. That's a definite no.
I mean, the IQ, it is so clear that IQ is the best predictor of success in academic success, professional success. Forget talking about group differences in IQ. But even with the fact with men and women, male and female average IQ is practically identical. So in that sense, women are as smart as men. But the range for men is much greater. So the ones at the top and the ones at the bottom. This, by the way, is true. Anything you measure, make up something, this ratio of wrist size to ankle size. You will find that the women, it's not necessarily the average is always the same, but you find the range tends to be much greater for men. So if you're talking about things like IQ, who cares about how people who have the lowest IQ, which tend to be male? Yes. It's the ones who have the highest IQ, and they tend to be male, even though the average tends to be the same.
Of course, this is denied to the extent where...
Oh, sure, for sure.
They're trying to force the women as well into positions in some of the sciences that they simply don't want to do.
Well, the award, I just pulled a blank on the name, but the award for the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in mathematics, I'm sorry, I just forgot for a moment. No, a woman has never won it based on I read, based on basic IQ intelligence, or you'd expect one woman to win every 103 years. None have in fact ever won it. You often hear women say, look how few women mathematicians there are. They shouldn't be. Women aren't as good at math, certainly at the high level. A woman who is good at mathematics, I would certainly agree, should be encouraged. That's a different thing. But the idea that there should be equal numbers of women, it just runs counter to everything we know about testing of mathematical and IQ ability. Kids have been kicked out for that, for saying that. I'm retired. I can say anything I want.
And I mean, that's why it's so terrifying, as you've said, because it's simply the fact that empirical data are being ignored. So IQ is just being ignored, and it's purely for ideological reasons. And we've been here before.
I should say, however, that it's not 100% true. There is a group for certain journals like Intelligence. There's a whole group that studies IQ. That studies it perfectly straightforward. It's not just gender, but racial. It's an enclosed group that has very little effect on newspapers, for example, on what the general public. But it's not like a society in which they've locked them up. With gender differences, it's much greater than IQ. The pressures are much greater, but you still can say it. I still basically could say what I want to say. It's nobody wants to hear it. So there was some that'll listen to it. There's and there were a good number of people who liked the stuff that I said. But if you're trying to get to the general, the newspaper reading audience, you're not going to. Maybe this will change. It certainly seems now politically that it's somewhat changing, but that's more just anger at the government, I think, than anything else.
Yes, that's an important perspective. Thank you for that. Well, between now and a transhumanist world, perhaps in the future, where we are able to make of ourselves whatever we will, can alter our DNA and do all sorts of things. We're basically stuck with how mum and dad made us, what our genes and perhaps certain epigenetic or socialized effects on us there are, and that involves these very distinct gender differences.
Right.
So
and always in 100,000 years, man, who knows? But as far as we can see that makes any sense in predicting it, it'll always be like that. It always has been. It's not just us. I don't deal with non-human species, but basically through the primates, it certainly did. Go further than the primates, then there are differences. But until some species comes to replace us, and that's not going to happen soon, it's going to be this way. What will vary is how people feel about it. 50, 60 years ago, there was none of this complaining about it. Men were happy to be men, women were happy to be women. Now there are a lot who are unhappy about it, but that really has no effect. It has an effect on how people feel.
Well, I'm really grateful that you summarised it all so brilliantly. I hope everyone hearing this will immediately go and buy Why Men Rule.
Well, not so brilliantly, but I appreciated the opportunity. You're certainly nice.
Thank you.
I enjoyed this. It was very nice.
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you, Steve, very much. I really appreciated it.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve. You take care now.